Hi, my name's Rebecca Lee, and I'm the co-author of this book here with Andy Cutler, PhD, about mercury poisoning. And I was rummaging around in the basement, and I found this article by Alfred Stock, the German chemist, and I thought I'd read some of it. In Wikipedia, on the page about him, about Alfred Stock, there's a photo portrait where he looks so wan and sad. Well, he lived through 2 world wars, dying at age 70 in 1946, 2 years before I was born. He also got mercury poisoning from the work he was doing in his lab at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. So I came across this in the basement. I know it's a very famous article. I'm sure that many of you who are dealing with chelation and mercury poisoning have read it, but it's so fascinating. I thought I'd read some of it out loud here. So I'm skipping parts of it because it's really, really long. So he starts off how it spoiled his life and how he's able to talk about it now because he's better. But he says the insidious horror of mercury poisoning is not nearly sufficiently well known and is being taken note of too little in those places where one is particularly threatened by it, in chemical and physical laboratories. For nearly 25 years, I have suffered from ailments which in the beginning arose only occasionally, then gradually got worse and worse, and finally increased to unbearable proportions so that I despairingly doubted my ability to continue to work scientifically. The cause was understood neither by me nor many outstanding physicians. They thought that it was possible that it could be found in the especially narrow build of the nasal passages and an unusual irritability of the nasal mucosa. Because of this, I underwent decades of treatments of the nose with cauterizations, burning, massages, electrification, and bloody operations without success. 2 years ago, a few of my colleagues fell ill with similar symptoms. It was accidentally discovered that it had to do with an insidious poisoning by mercury vapor. In my chemical work, which involves testing of volatile substances by the vacuum method, which uses mercury tubes, pumps, manometers, and valves, I had been in constant contact with mercury for 25 years. Today, there is no doubt about the diagnosis anymore because all my symptoms, although not gone completely, have more or less been diminished after having avoided inhaling mercury vapors for the last 2 years without the use of any other healing methods. First, I am describing the difficulties as they developed in me over time. They are identical to an insidious mercury poisoning in every detail. I was able to convince myself of this through my colleagues and other peers who suffered and still suffer from mercury vapor poisoning. Some of them, it is noted, were not cognizant of the origin of their difficulties. Many pertinent symptoms have, up to now, been insufficiently described. At any rate, insidious mercury vapor poisoning has not received the attention it deserves. With me, the situation began with a slight intermittent headaches and mild drowsiness, which increased gradually over the years to constant nervous restlessness and jitteriness. Head pressure impaired the ability to think. It worsened and finally became an almost uninterrupted vexing headache, sitting mostly over the eyes. I had strong vertigo, which was occasionally connected with visual disturbances like unclear and double vision. Soon the upper air passages were involved as well. This started with a slight transient nose cold. This was followed by a constant stuffy nose, which later turned into severe nose, throat, and sinus infections. They were followed one by one, almost without interruption, by pussy, often bloody mucosal discharge and scabbing, frequent sore throats, and ear aches connected to auditory loss and loss of smell. Some sense of smell remained, for instance, cyanic acid. There was a distaste for tobacco smoke. During the last years prior to recognition of the poisoning, there were added signs: a strong flow of saliva, a sour, insipid taste in the mouth, infections of the eyes and oral mucosa. There were little blisters, sensitive and sore areas on the tongue, the palate, the gums, and the inside of the lips and cheeks. There was reddening of the gums and slight bleeding while brushing the teeth. There were toothaches, receding of the gums and formations of pockets, and temporary loosening of individual teeth. The mouth and tooth signs revealed themselves only In part, they only reached their peak months after recognition of the poisoning, because since my youth, I have been taking good care of my teeth, among other things, nightly long rinses with 1.5% hydrogen peroxide solution and sodium bicarbonate. If this hadn't been the case, I might possibly have become aware of the cause of my problems through mouth infections. Other signs were mental weariness and exhaustion, lack of inclination and an inability to perform any particularly mental work, an increased need for sleep. There were tremors of the spread out fingers and also sometimes the eyelids. There was pain in various locations of the body, tearing in the back and limbs, and pressure in the liver area. At times there were disturbances of stomach and intestinal activity, loss of appetite, sudden bladder pressure, isolated bouts of diarrhea, which occurred without other possible causes. There were sudden blistery rashes, that is, on the sides of the arms and thighs. The most depressing accompanying sign relating to mental work was the diminishment of memory. My memory, which had previously been excellent, left more and more to be desired and became worse and worse until 2 years ago I suffered from nearly complete memory loss. Only with the help of extensive notes and great efforts was I able to put together a scientific paper or deliver a lecture. I forgot the telephone number on the way from the telephone book to the telephone. I forgot everything that I had once learned by heart. I forgot the content of the book or theater play I had just read or seen, as well as my own work, which had been published. It was impossible for me to remember numbers and names. Often even the names of good acquaintances were lost. Specifically, I lost the ability for arithmetic and mathematical figuring. Also, my chess playing ability suffered. The impairment of memory, particularly that of people memory, and the worsening ability to do arithmetic seemed to be signs peculiar to insidious mercury vapor poisoning. This showed itself in blatant form in my co-workers and other people whom I got to know who had been under the influence of mercury for a longer period of time. Soon after all of us in the laboratory had found out what was wrong with us, we sat down together to put down on paper a completed piece of work where we had to do a lot of mathematics. None of us was able to add up a column of 10 to 20 multi-digit numbers without making mistakes. While my physical ability, that is mountain climbing, did not seem to have been weakened, the ability to work mentally suffered a little, although not in as devastating a fashion as has been the case with memory. Added to that were depression and a vexing inner restlessness, which later also caused restless sleep. By nature companionable and loving life, I withdrew moodily into myself, shied away from the public, stayed away from people and social activities, and unlearned the joy in art and nature. Humor became rusty. Obstacles which formerly I would have overlooked smilingly, and am overlooking again today, seemed insurmountable. Scientific work caused great effort. I forced myself to go to the laboratory without being able to get anything useful accomplished in spite of all efforts. Thought came laboriously and pedantically. I had to deny myself working on solutions to questions beyond the nearest tasks at hand. The lecture that used to be a pleasure became a torture. The preparations for a lecture, the writing of a dissertation, or merely a simple letter caused unending effort and styling the material and wrestling with the language. Not seldom did it happen that I misspelled words or left out letters. It was not nice to be aware of these shortcomings, not to know their cause, not to know a way to their elimination, and to have to fear further deterioration. All attempts to improve the situation went awry. Staying in the mountains for many weeks did not help. I felt hardly less ill than in Berlin. The nose treatments and operations sometimes brought short-lived yet never-lasting relief. It was never-lasting relief. It was peculiar that all mental difficulties disappeared for hours when the physician treated certain areas of the mucosa of the upper nose with cocaine. When the right spot was hit, a headache and vertigo disappeared sometimes in a few minutes. Memory, inclination to work, and good mood reappeared, but sadly only as fleeting guests. Sometimes I made use of this possibility to call them up before a lecture, an important meeting, etc. So he goes on to talk about how he discovered that his colleagues and PhD students were also getting symptoms. I'll skip all that, but just cite what one of his colleagues from Spain said. For me, it was as if I was getting dumber and dumber in Germany. So then it goes on, particularly significant for insidious mercury poisoning is the noticeable coming and going of symptoms. Following a few days or weeks of improved well-being comes sometimes setting in suddenly a time of increased ill health. This all happens in the form of frequent relapses during the recovery period. As soon as my illness had reached its pinnacle, there were as a rule 1 or 2 tolerable days. Then the saliva flow, runny nose, and sinusitis starting from the nose down to the throat and sliding to the bronchi increased again. There were tooth inflammations, highest fatigability and drowsiness, vexing headaches, often also tearing and diarrhea. Headache, drowsiness, and memory loss are connected to the irritation of the nerves, leading to the upper part of the nose, seen in the already mentioned effect of cocaine application on the nasal mucosa. After that, he talks about the similarities between mercury poisoning and the better-known lead poisoning. Then the measures he and his colleagues took to remedy the situation in their labs so that they could work safely as per the testing and cleanliness of the air. Then he talks about some of the measures they took to recover. Mostly they rely on the body's healing itself once the exposure was eliminated. And of course, they didn't know anything about chelation, which thank goodness we do now. But I found this paragraph interesting. It seems that an existing mercury intoxication preconditions a special sensitivity vis-a-vis renewed exposure from mercury vapor. Some of us who at our work and also during occasional mistakes with ventilation had come in contact again with more mercury, noticing this soon because of the stronger symptomatology after the relapses. That is not surprising because as the long development period of the insidious illness shows, a certain borderline value has to be reached before noticeable symptoms appear. The borderline value is certainly exceeded for a long time, even during recovery, so that each added amount of mercury worsens your well-being at once. At the end of the paper, he says, why were our illnesses not recognized? Why were our illnesses not recognized sooner as being mercury poisoning? I have often asked myself this question, not without self-accusations. The first signs, those that preceded the oral signs of slow mercury poisoning, are hardly known by the medical profession. They consist only of fatigue, lowering of thinking, of memory skills, slight headaches and drowsiness, and rare occasional diarrhea. In the same way, it was little known until now that the nose and remaining breathing passages are being compromised in the form of a runny nose and sinusitis. But exactly these symptoms brought me and the physicians who treated me on the wrong track and have been misleading in other cases that I have come to know about. Thus, one of my assistants was treated for a long time for sinus infection before the true cause came to light. By the way, balanced judgment of the bad situation becomes impaired in those who are affected exactly because of the existing drowsiness. Quem mercurius perdere vult dementat prius. Who mercury wants to destroy, he first robs of his mind. And then he goes on to talk about amalgams. At this time, I would like to warn about a little-known source of insidious mercury poisoning. It is amalgam tooth fillings. Professor Lewin suggested to me at once when he noticed mercury poisoning in me to replace all amalgam fillings, of which I had a considerable number in my mouth since early youth, with other fillings. Telling me this, he recalled a case of a university colleague who was at the edge of a mental and physical collapse when the cause was found just in time. It was found in the numerous amalgam fillings stemming from the time when he was young. After their removal, slow recovery followed. And he does an experiment with amalgam fillings. He designed an experiment with amalgam fillings to see how much vapor is let off. And the conclusion was, without doubt, the fillings that were used here in the laboratory would have allowed mercury to evaporate from the mouth as well and supplied the inhaled air with small amounts of mercury, which in the long run has to be harmful. The old copper and cadmium amalgams are likely to be even more harmful. That was what they used before they used mercury. And so that was 1926 that he did this experiment, or before 1926, and here we are, 2021, and they're still using mercury amalgam fillings. So at the end of the paper, his conclusions seem rather poignant. This was written 100 years ago, and not much has changed. Insidious mercury poisonings are certainly much more common than ordinarily thought. This is true particularly for chemists and physicists who so often have to work with it. The great danger here is being noted much too little, and the true cause of symptoms and illness is often not recognized. In literature, you find almost nothing about this. Since the discovery of our misfortune, I have found about a dozen certain cases of insidious mercury poisoning just in the circle of my acquaintances. They almost always have the same symptoms. Often the correct cause was missed, and therefore the correct treatment was missed as well. An important example is that of a foreign colleague who had been working with mercury apparatuses for a long time. When he visited me and I asked him whether he had ever felt any mercury poisoning, he decidedly said that he had not. Upon further questioning about his health, he then admitted, "I am in bad shape. For years I have been suffering from neurasthenia and had to stay away from the laboratory from time to time." The doctors had tried all kinds of things with him. They had treated him for stomach, intestinal, and rib cage disease with a special diet, etc. In reality, what he had been dealing with was full-blown mercury poisoning, without doubt. One unknowing victim of mercury poisoning has probably been Faraday. So here he goes on to think about famous people that had all kinds of problems, and he's realizing that they probably had mercury poisoning. So Faraday, in the last 2 to 3 decades of his life, which came to an end in his late 70s, he was bothered increasingly by health problems, which made his scientific work more and more difficult, and which played a significant role in his letters and descriptions of his life. They were diagnosed by physicians as neurasthenia and early onset arterial sclerosis. They consisted of, at times, strong mental and physical fatigue, irritable weakness, headaches, vertigo, rheumatism, and more than anything else, constant increasing memory loss. Faraday, being spared serious bodily illnesses, was even in old age a strong hiker and swimmer, but he avoided people for the last third of his life. Scientific work, including his lectures, were continued with long interruptions into the last decade of his life. It is heartrending to read the great researcher's letters that he went to see his physician friends so often to complain to him about vertigo and headache, that he couldn't remember names, that he was losing the connections with his colleagues, that he was forgetting his own work and notes, that he was forgetting his letter writing, and that he didn't know anymore how to write words. The affected organ is my head. The result is loss of memory and clarity and vertigo. All these symptoms make it most likely that Faraday suffered from an insidious mercury poisoning from the vapors used in the laboratory. It makes you shudder to think how, in all likelihood, this rich intellect could have been freed from this suffering, and what gifts he could have given to science if the cause of his illness could have been recognized and remedied. Maybe Professor Marburg brings this to my attention. The mysterious sickness the mathematician, physicist, and philosopher Blaise Pascal succumbed to when he was still young was mercury poisoning. Pascal worked with mercury in his well-known barometer research. His suffering from sustained headaches, vertigo, toothache, loss of appetite, and lasting bad colic complete the picture of advanced slow mercury poisoning. No doubt mercury, the use of which sadly cannot be done away with in research, has done heavy damage to science in the past, as it still does today in the way it curtailed the output of many a researcher. May this present-day warning help us pay better attention and avoid the dangers of this insidious metal. So I guess labs are a little cleaner than they used to be. There's some sort of, what did he call it? Industrial hygiene, Andy called it. But unfortunately, people are still getting poisoned apace from mercury vapor.